walking in a country road, and I've been chasing after my shadow.
Welcome back to the Camino Podcast, episode 104. I'm Dave Whitson.
Nobody asked me my name.
All right, folks, you know the drill at this point. I show up, drop a flurry of episodes, and then disappear for a while. I'm flying out to Italy today to pursue the second half of my 6 months of walking across the peninsula. Whereas the first leg brought me from Matera and Santa Maria di Leuca in the south to Trieste and the Slovenian border in the north, this time I'm reversing the trajectory. I will start on the Swiss side of things in Bourg-Saint-Pierre, and I'll follow the Via Francigena over the Grand Saint Bernard Pass and down through the Aosta Valley. In Pavia, I'll take a right turn and we'll climb back into the Alps, following a little bit of the Via degli Abate, but also freestyling en route to Genoa. From there, I will follow the Via della Costa southward through Cinque Terre before rejoining the Via Francigena in Sarzana. My route is mostly straightforward from that point through Rome, and then onward to Teano on the Via Francigena Sud. Then I will have a longer stretch of freestyling, the only prolonged part of this walk without an established pilgrim road to follow. Even then, though, I'm stoked to walk over Mount Vesuvius, through Pompeii, and across the Amalfi coast to Positano, before eventually working my way inland to the Camino Basiliano. I will follow that newly developing route through Calabria, all the way down to the toes of the boot in Reggio Calabria. And then I'll take a ferry across to Sicily, following the Via Normanna to Randazzo, the Via Fabaria over Mount Etna and onward to Agrigento, and finally the Magna Via Francigena to Palermo and the finish line. If you want to follow along, here are the options. I post daily photos on Instagram, DaveXUSA, and my personal Facebook page. My daily write-ups gradually appear, on davewhitson.com, and on Patreon, which is a subscription service starting at $3 US per month, though there are some free posts shared there as well. You have immediate access to those write-ups, along with daily videos, GPS tracks, and other resources related to the routes I'm following. You also have full access to the Patreon archives, which at this point include 3 months of posts from the first leg of the Italy walk, 4 months from the last part of my trans-US walk, and 16 draft chapters from the Camino Compendium. There's a bunch of stuff on there. Like the podcast, it's important to me to push a ton of stuff out for free. It's awesome just to have people interested in reading or listening. The Patreon's there, though, as a donativo-style model. If you'd like to support me in this, it's an option. As is buying my new book, the aforementioned Camino Compendium. All right, the self-promotional onslaught is over, much to all of our relief. On with the show. For this last episode before break, I spoke with Father Brendan McManus, a Jesuit priest and pilgrim who has quite a set of publications associated with pilgrimage, including the memoir of his pivotal journey on the Camino Frances, Redemption Road, Grieving on the Camino. It should be noted up front that the discussion partially involves the story at the heart of that memoir, which centers on his brother's death by suicide. One of the biggest reasons that I wanted to connect with Brendan was to explore some of the rich Ignatian insights that he has to share, some of which are spotlighted in Redemption Road and his recently co-authored Living the Camino Back Home, Ignatian Tips for Keeping the Camino Spirit Alive. In the process, I discovered just how relevant those insights are to pilgrimage and the Camino, given the essential link between the Jesuit founder, Ignatius of Loyola, and the practice of pilgrimage. There's a lot to chew on here, for pilgrims new and old alike. So with that, for the last time for a little while, I hope you enjoy. Father Brendan McManus, S.J., is the author of Redemption Road, Grieving on the Camino, Living the Camino Back Home, and The Way to Manresa, among other things. You can find him online at redemptionroadcamino.com. Well, thank you, Brendan, for speaking with me today about Everything Camino. I have a long list of topics I'm interested in hitting with you. Let's just start with your first book on your first Camino de Santiago experience, Redemption Road. I certainly have my own reactions to it, but I'm curious when you're talking with other pilgrims, reflecting on that first experience, how do you describe that first experience to other pilgrims?
The first thing was it wasn't my first Camino experience. Now, this really important thing that remember part of my training as a Jesuit, we had to do a Camino in Spain back in 1994. Just two of us who were training to be a Jesuit, and we had to do like 500 kilometers on the Ignatian Camino, which runs the opposite direction to the main Camino. But that was without any money and asking for food and accommodation. That was my first real kind of hardcore Camino experience, but that's what got me addicted to it, you know. So by the time I got to that one, that was in 2011. That was obviously my brother had died by suicide, and it was quite a tough time for me personally. I'm the priest in the family, and I was doing the funeral, and I was caught up in a lot of the events and the grieving around that. So I just intuitively knew that the Camino was going to be the thing. I just knew that's where I needed to be. This was about 7 years after the actual death of my brother, but I knew I needed to do this, something for myself. So I did the northern route, 2011. So like that's 500 miles. You know, I had five injuries. I raised £5,000 for suicide bereavement charity there. But that was an epic walk for me personally. I mean, I just wanted to get out on my own in the mountains, and the northern route, as you probably know, is perfect for this. It's quite remote. It's very challenging route as well, you know, so I call it a mountain a day. But boy, did it do the business for me. You know, all those days, you know, weeks on my own walking in the mountains, it just brought me a lot of peace and brought me a lot of kind of centering, a lot of processing of the experience about what had happened. And then I had this amazing 11th hour kind of deliverance and finished there where I burnt my brother's t-shirt that I'd brought with me. And that was, I mean, that was a really, I can feel myself kind of choking up a bit, even thinking of that. That was one of the kind of top experiences of my life in terms of just release and catharsis and getting through something. I came back from that Camino just transformed, that I found I'd left a burden there. I'd taken off this burden of guilt and kind of shame and responsibility, everything to do with suicide and my brother. But I'd left it behind, and I came back transformed, you know, a different person, lighter and happier, you know, and my life kind of changed around that moment. But that was probably the big critical Camino experience that I had in my life. And certainly that book that I wrote about that experience, that changed my life on its own. It just put me on the map. I got all these invitations to speak, and you know, everything changed from that Camino. And then the book subsequently, it was on the Irish bestseller list back then in 2013, you know, so it was a big moment for me.
Yeah. It's a classic Camino story in a lot of ways because it captures how pilgrimage is a journey without and a journey within, that you
That's right.
tell this moving story about you and your family and your family tragedy with your brother. And then of course there's also the Camino that you're describing along the way. I want to ask you a couple questions about the latter first, because what stands out to me when I think about your physical journey on the Camino del Norte was just ouch. There's an injury early on. There is a detour to Burgos. There's a bus on your very first day back. Then there's
Yeah.
blisters, and then there's more blisters.
Mhm.
It just reads like you were courting disaster all the way through, constantly on the verge of your whole Camino breaking down. So, what do you make of that aspect of the trip looking back on it? All of those physical hardships that you were managing.
I mean, in some ways, it's pretty standard Camino fare, you know, that things happen and there's these challenges. And I'll never forget, to remember the trip to Burgos, and I met this Jesuit brother. I was just resting up. I had shin splints, which are quite painful, and I had to rest up in the doctor's orders. And I was in this Jesuit community, and I was to this Jesuit brother, and I was explaining to him that I had these shin splints. I was out of action. It was a disaster, you know. And he said to me, you know, really intensely, he said, you know, you think it's a disaster. He said, but this is the Camino, you know, this is how you deal with this setback. That is what's going to make this Camino experience. And boy, was he right, and boy, did I ever benefit from that. Like I've told that story to hundreds of people, and I have helped people to understand their own kind of injury experiences. And then this is true of life in general, things happen and things go off track and unexpected things, twists happen. But this is part of the magic of the Camino, the magic of life, providence, the way things play out. If you can roll with it and if you can let go of like expectations is a huge thing. We have this kind of perfection thing that I'm going to walk the Camino. It's going to be perfect. I'm going to do it all in half the time, at twice the speed, And the Camino teaches these lessons about life, especially about humility and especially about like embodiment, about really living your human life, inhabiting your body, realizing limitations. And also realizing your greatness within that, your ability to rise above these things and get through difficulty and learning the lessons, I think for me is the big Camino message, Like the Camino teaches, slow down. That was the thing I had to learn, stop going so fast, smell the roses, enjoy the day and let go of your goals. That's probably the key thing. Almost every time I had an injury, it was because I was overdoing something or pushing too hard or trying to get somewhere. So I think eventually I learned to let go. Eventually I threw away the guidebook at one stage and I abandoned my plan about certain days, getting there in a certain time and just walk and just be there. And that was a huge thing for me. Just simply be present on the Camino, walking in nature and just enjoy being there. You don't know what's going to happen and you can't control things. So just enjoy being in the moment. That was the big learning for me, I think.
I've read a lot of Camino memoirs, and so I am primed to expect certain narrative arcs, that sort of the
Yeah.
hero's journey recurs a lot of the time. And so as I was reading you confronting adversity, I kept thinking, now it's going to turn the corner. Now it's going to
Yeah.
turn the corner. Finally, he's going to have good health. He's going to just run triumphantly to the finish line. And it never really happened. You were managing it right to the end. And coming out of that, I would just think a person would come out of that experience thinking, clearly, this Camino business is not for me. I could
Mhm.
never get healthy. But instead, you took it in an entirely different direction.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the funny thing is I kind of crawled into Santiago at the end of all that. I was absolutely, done in, exhausted, because every time you have an injury, it kind of sets you back. And then there's something in me knew that it wasn't over until it's over, So, and I think that goes back to that first Camino I mentioned as part of our training as Jesuits when we were in the Basque Country. And I remember I was thinking of giving up back then. I mean, we'd done a week just asking for food and accommodation, and it was really tough going. You think the Camino is tough, like, but this was really challenging. Like I hadn't eaten properly, hadn't slept properly. And I was saying to the guy I was with, I was thinking of abandoning the walk and going home. And he said, that's fine. He said, if you want to go home, he said, but you haven't prayed about this. You haven't kind of handed this over. You think it's all about you being the great hero and doing all these great things. So I got the strength or the grace or the courage to keep going back then. But that little insight always comes back to me, every time, like almost on a daily basis, and certainly on the Camino, just to trust and hang in there and keep doing the right things, and eventually things will switch around. So I think that's what helped me to understand all these things that happened on the Camino del Norte in 2011. So getting through challenging situations. The real miracle is that I was able to keep going after each one, Like I managed to heal the blisters, to get over the shin splints, to get over various things. And each episode had its own gifts as well. People I met and getting help was a huge Camino thing, obviously, asking and receiving help. So all those really beautiful things. But then getting to finish there at the end, obviously, and getting that moment with burning my brother's t-shirt out on the peninsula. You can't burn stuff now, obviously, out there. So that was then, but that little act that little kind of symbolic act. I always say to people, it was this symbol, my brother's t-shirt, and then it was the ritual of burning, and then it was the Camino, having done this huge journey and having experienced all these things. And there's a certain level of penitential aspect to the Camino, which I think is key and is a very traditional thing in terms of the spirituality of the Camino. So somehow all of that came together in that moment at the end and burning the t-shirt and getting that release. And it was only then I understood what the whole Camino was about. Like I understood the reasons for everything. The whole thing was like a preparation for this one extraordinary moment, this one beautiful moment, which, I would never have missed. I would never have wanted to have missed that. And somehow, I think my Jesuit training, my previous Camino experiences, especially that one in Spain way back, it all prepared me for that moment in order to receive this very beautiful thing that I needed desperately. So I think it's something of that, something inside of me knew that this was going to come right in the end, and just to hang in there and keep trusting in the providence of the Camino. And obviously there's a huge spiritual dimension in all of this for me.
And there's two things there that you just touched on that I want to follow up on. I want to go into much greater detail on your Jesuit training and that aspect of this. But you also mentioned the process of asking for and receiving help. And that jumped out at me at multiple points in Redemption Road, right from the foreword, where Paul Kelly spotlights your distinct capacity to seek help when you were in the
Mm.
depths of grief. And so many of us, especially men,
Mm.
struggle with this. When we find ourselves in a hole, we just keep digging.
Yeah.
So how did you do it? What opened you up to pursuing help?
Yeah, again, I'll tell you a story about my brother. Remember, he was the one that took his own life, but I witnessed him, obviously, and I accompanied him on his journey, trying to help him, trying to set up appointments, therapists, doctors, etc. But the thing I noticed was that he never accepted help. He never really asked for it. He never followed up. He never took the therapy or the medication or what he was meant to do. He just kept repeating this pattern of not really engaging. And I thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to do the opposite of this, in terms of my own kind of dealing with the grief, trying to honor my brother's memory and trying to do something about kind of suicide bereavement. So that message was kind of instilled in me right from the beginning, that you have to ask for help. And also, not to be embarrassed about it or not to worry about it. Just like if you need something, just go and get it and ask for it and demand it. So that little insight helped me enormously. And obviously on the Camino, then that became key because there were lots of people I needed to ask for help all the time. But people showed up, and this is the Camino miracle. People showed up exactly when I needed them, and the right people, and getting advice about things and learning how to manage myself, how to get the right pace, how to keep going. How to get the right footwear was a big thing. At one stage, I had to change my insoles in order to get the right support. So that theme about asking for help and getting help became an enormous thing. And then ironically, that is exactly what I think I was able to help people afterwards. I worked in suicide bereavement as a direct result of the Camino plus the book that I'd written. And then I wrote another book subsequently about suicide bereavement specifically. And that's one of the key things I say to people. You have to ask for help. And like you say, sometimes men struggle with that, struggle with asking for help, putting it out there and admitting kind of weakness or need or necessity. So I was trying to reverse a lot of that and trying to say to people, look, just get what you need, ask for it. And it's always there. This is the other huge irony, it's always there waiting for us. I often say about my brother, I say that he drowned in a swimming pool full of lifeguards.
Hmm.
It's one of the images I use. There was lots of people around him that could have helped him and would have loved to have helped him, but he never reached out. So that stuck with me. Obviously, these are real hard-earned lessons, from kind of life and suicide bereavement, going through these really traumatic things. But I think somehow the Camino managed to help me to put all that into action and managed to deliver for me and give me this huge kind of grace and peace with all of that. So I'm just enormously grateful for all that.
Thank you for that answer. The centrality of your belief, your practice as a Jesuit was also a big takeaway for me from Redemption Road. It's one of the places I learned a lot, and it's something I really wanted to explore with you. Could we just zoom out to start for those who know very little about the Jesuits and here in the United States, I think people know that the Jesuits run some colleges here, and they may not know too much beyond that. So for the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order, it actually has its roots on the Camino. So what is the story there?
Yeah, so the Jesuits go right back to the experience of Ignatius Loyola, who was the founder of the Jesuits, and he was a Basque. He was a soldier originally, and then he was injured. This is the real connection with the Camino here. He was injured in a battle in Pamplona, which is on the French Camino, of course, and his leg was damaged really seriously, like broke in multiple places, and he had to recuperate. And he was back in his home place in Loyola, again, which is in the Basque Country. And he had this really powerful experience, but he was fantasizing about different ways of life or different options in his life. And one option was the kind of hero, the swashbuckling hero, and winning the hand of this lady and doing all these extraordinary deeds, that kind of ego-based stuff. And he noticed it filled him with delight, but afterwards it left him empty and dry, which is like an emotional, like an internal thing. And then he was also imagining outdoing the saints, Saint Dominic, Saint Francis, but going on the road. This is the Camino connection, being a pilgrim. And he noticed that those imaginings, daydreams, they filled him with life and lasted over time, lasted for days and weeks. That kind of dream. And eventually figured this was God or the divine speaking to him directly. And God was leading him in a certain direction away from certain kind of selfish, ego-based things towards more of a life out in the world, engaged with people, helping people. And he decided to become a pilgrim originally, and he went on the road. He gave up his old life. He was from a very noble family, and he just gave all that up. And he went on the road, literally walking on the road with nothing, gave away his money, gave away all his clothes at one stage, and walked the roads of Europe and depending on other people for food and accommodation, and found great joy. Eventually, I mean, he had to figure out how to do this as he went along. He had to refine. In the beginning, he was full of zeal and excess, and he had to learn how to row back from that and find the balance is one of the key Jesuit things, and trying to find a moderate way of doing things. But it was on the road where he learned most of his lessons. And the whole Jesuit spirituality is basically a pilgrim spirituality. And it's often called like finding God in all things. So, like, God or the divine is always speaking to us at all moments in our life. And our job is to tune into that and find where God is calling us. But especially, we have to be kind of nimble and light on our feet. And we have to not to be caught up in things or surrounded by too much stuff or distracted by too many things. We have to be present in the moment with people, with ourselves, and reading what's going on. So that internal read in situations, which allows you to figure out what the best thing to do, how to connect with other people, especially how to do the best thing in the situation and how to help others. So the whole Jesuit system was born from that pilgrim experience, and it is a pilgrim spirituality, and it's really practical. It's really kind of down to earth and rooted. But that's the story, and that's the Camino connection, that he walked the Caminos of Europe, and he learned all these lessons, and he put this pilgrim spirituality into action, and that's what we get trained in. So it's all about being aware of what's going on inside yourself and being flexible, being able to let go of things, not being too caught up in things. So you can see how this starts to apply to my redemption road journey. That try not to have too many fixed ideas or try not to have expectations too high. Try to do the best thing you can within the situation, whatever that is, and trust that something good will come out of this. Hang in there, tough moments, enjoy the lovely days, the sunshine and the mountains in the Basque Country, and then trust that this is all going somewhere. So I think something like that, that the Jesuit wisdom over the years, this kind of robust spirituality, being on the road, a kind of a dynamic finding of God in all things. I think I would describe it like that.
There are some aspects of this practice that show up in Redemption Road in concrete ways, one of which was the practice of discernment.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what that entails, the practice of discernment?
Sure. So discernment is a key Jesuit word. It's a bit of a buzzword, but discern means to separate, like to separate. We have things that are good and from God over here, and we have things that are not good and not from God. So the first kind of Jesuit principle is that there's always kind of two spirits or two voices speaking to you, and one is good and the other is not good, obviously. So you have to separate and distinguish what they are. And then you have to follow the good, obviously, and leave behind the bad, So you have to choose. So it has to boil down to a concrete decision. It's just like a fork in the road. You always have choices, and choices of different consequences and bring you to different places. So you have to try to figure out in advance what would be a good choice, what would be a good road to take. And inside yourself, normally you have a read, you have a sense about things, about options, about what road is going to bring me where, and you try to bring those consequences forward and you try to make the best decision you can at that moment. And it's kind of dynamic, it's on the fly a lot of the time. So you have this objective information about this particular road will bring me here, these consequences. And then you also have the internal, the subjective, which is the big thing. Often that inner feel, the intuitive sense of things will give you a huge read on what to do. Given that we know ourselves and we know our weaknesses and our tendencies, often we tend to choose one thing over another. So getting in touch with ourselves, being realistic about our choices, knowing myself, but like Socrates, way back, the Greek wisdom, to know yourself is one of the great wisdom. So that's the Jesuit discernment, try to tune into yourself and the reality and then try to make the best decision. But then the other part of this is you reflect on what's happened. So I take the road, I see what that experience is like, and then I reflect, and then I say to myself, is this still good? Sometimes it means changing, going back to the original decision, taking another road, or just keep going, obviously. So that's discernment, dynamic reading of situations for internally and externally, and trying to make the best decision possible for you and for others and for the world. Something like that.
It seems to place a lot of emphasis on intuition, and this could be a whole different discussion. I worry sometimes about our capacity to judge things accurately, meaningfully, with all of the different information coming at us now.
Yeah, that's right. It's a huge thing. And I think probably intuition is probably the wrong word there. There's probably trying to figure out, what would be a good thing to do. So often I have an immediate response to things. I like this, I don't like that. And the Jesuit thing would be let's go a bit deeper. Let's see what my motivations are, what I'm prioritizing, what is the good thing to do, what's the really good thing to do here, and what am I being called to do? Often I have my own read. I'd like to do this, and then I try to consult with the higher power, and I'm saying, show me what would be a good thing to do. Show me my weakness. And another key Jesuit kind of technique is work out what your weakness is and what that decision would look like, and then avoid that. So, so just again, know yourself, know your limitations, and work around those. So if I tend to choose the easy option all the time, you can see this in Redemption Road. Sometimes you choose the harder option because that's where you're being called, and that's the good thing to do. And it stretches you and it brings you out of yourself and it makes you grow. And often those are the good decisions. Being aware of my own tendency to choose an easy option, choose what feels good. And that often that doesn't work out well, obviously, in today's world. Just because it feels good, often it might not be good. So there's that inner process of examining things, knowing myself, and then separating out different things. It does take a bit of practice, and it does take some kind of dedication to looking at things and consultation, gathering information as well is a huge part of that.
One of the ways I saw this play out most often in the book, and that I think is most relevant to pilgrims, it's certainly something that I was very interested in, was when you were trying to discern when suffering is sufficient, when there's
Mm.
appropriate challenge, when it's character building, when it's a suitable test of the spirit, and when, by contrast, suffering is excessive or harmful. Where have you arrived on trying to judge where that line is between those two things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a tough one. I think one of the starting points is that, suffering in itself is not a value. We don't just do things because they make us suffer, obviously. But obviously, the other side of that is sometimes, tough choices, especially the Camino, some choices entail kind of necessary suffering and unavoidable suffering. So the Jesuit thing would be trying to find peace in taking these moments of unavoidable suffering, but which lead to a greater good and which lead to a better place. And that's the best discernment, if you like, trying to figure out what are my motivations here. It can't be just choose the suffering option. It has to be choosing the greater good option. Often there's a bit of suffering entailed in that, but there's a kind of a goal at the end, which is a good thing, and you recognize it. That has worked really well for me, obviously, in my life in general, but especially on the Camino. Sometimes you have to dig deep, and sometimes you have really tough days on the Camino, but sometimes you break through into some amazing, new places and learning about oneself and new humility, new insights, etc. So, I always say to people, the Camino is not an easy thing. People tend to dress it up today as if it was, just a piece of cake, and you just go out there and it's an amazing experience. And I say to people, those people celebrating in the square have been through a really tough experience. I often call it like a U-shaped curve. They've had this honeymoon period. They've hit the really difficult moments. Inevitably on the Camino, you hit your limits, exhaustion, thirst, hunger, patience, the end of your patience, snapping at people, the guy snoring all night in the albergue. But somehow you break through that, and that's the coming out of the U-shaped curve, where you start to see some things you didn't see before. You start to learn some things, and you get these extraordinary insights. So I say to people, that is the Camino, that U-shaped curve. There is some suffering, some of it's unavoidable, and you got to accept that. And you don't just choose suffering for the sake of it, but it can be really growthful. A lot of the key Camino insights are tough learnings, things that I have had to learn the hard way, and that's, I guess, true for me. It's probably true for a lot of people.
You mentioned reflection as being an important part of the discernment process. You make the decision, you reflect upon the decision. And one other aspect of Jesuit practice that stood out to me in Redemption Road was the review of the day or the night prayer.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how that works?
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the key Ignatian techniques. It's called the examen, and it's a Latin word. It just means to review. So people call it the review of the day, and it's normally done at the end of the day. It's like a catch-all at the end of the day where you review your whole day. And I often say to people, it's a bit like watching a movie of your day. But the difference is you're kind of looking at it with God or the higher power, or you're looking at it with a bit of perspective. So you see things you didn't notice, but you have to start from gratitude. This is the key thing. Often we tend to focus just exclusively on the negative thing that happened. I had a really bad moment. I had a run in with someone, and our mind goes for the negative. But in this particular technique, you start with the positive. So you look through your day and you think about this Camino day, just like you think about it, the wildflowers I saw, the butterflies, the beauty of the mountain where I was meeting these pilgrims. You think about that first, you get yourself to gratitude, and then you look through the day and it looks completely different. You see all the dimensions. It's a bit like a journey of the hills and the valleys, but you see it all, and you see where you were tuned in and connected to God or the higher power and to gratitude. And you see where you were disconnected, like the low points, the valleys. And you learn how to be more tuned in. You spot what helps you and you spot where you get thrown off track, and you spot where sometimes like something comes up in me and I get short-tempered, or I have a negative desire or negative perspective about someone, but it turns out to be false often, so working through stuff and processing it and reflecting on it helps me to learn, how I am, how the world is, and what I'm being invited to. So it's an amazingly, I recommend it highly to everyone. It's an amazingly effective technique, but it works over time, gradually over time, weeks and months. It helps you to be more tuned in and to be more aware of yourself, who's around you, what forces are operating on you, and how to choose well is the ultimate thing, how to make better decisions and how to live a better day the next day. That's the key thing.
One of the interesting things to me is what you were just describing could be extended to a lot of the practices that have been promoted by the field of positive psychology over the last 20 years. And, what's old is new again, that we're not necessarily discovering anything new. There's this wisdom that has taken different forms over the years. And so this practice connects with that. And there's plenty of evidence that suggests, yes, it does work. It makes us more fulfilled, happy people.
Exactly. They often describe St. Ignatius Loyola as the first psychologist. He was the first one to take the inner life seriously, like the world of our own inner movements, our own desires is a huge Ignatian thing. What is motivating me? What are my priorities? What do I really want? And what's going to make me really happy? So then working with that inner life, that inner experience is the big Ignatian thing. And he was right at the beginning of modernism, obviously, the turn to the human subject and Descartes and all of that movement in psychology. So he was right at the forefront of all that.
And this is a natural bridge then to the third and last big topic I wanted to talk with you about. And it's what we do after. How do we make sense of our Camino? How do we bring it home? Your most recent book, co-authored with Catherine O'Flynn, Living the Camino Back Home, Ignatian Tips for Keeping the Camino Spirit Alive, relates to this. But it also just emerges out of your ongoing work with Camino Companions, which you just served with. So could you describe the Camino Companions project for us?
Sure, I've been privileged to be part of that Camino Companions project for a number of years now, but it's the simplest thing. It's a welcome in Santiago. It's actually in the pilgrim's office. It's on the first floor. So where people come in to get their Compostelas downstairs, you have to queue up and then they get their Compostela. And then just upstairs, there is an English welcome. In fact, there's welcome in all sorts of different languages, but the English welcome is run by the FCJ sisters. Catherine O'Flynn is one of those. And they provide this space. Is there just an open space for pilgrims to talk about what's happened on the Camino? The people that come there, often they're just finished the Camino either that day or the day before, and they need to talk. The way you have this amazing experience and you need to share it. You need to be listened to. And it's so helpful for people to be able to express what's inside of them, what has happened, what has touched their heart, what has transformed, even their pain and suffering, obviously, that can be so much a part of the Camino, to talk through that in order to get the insights, to get the wisdom, to get the learnings. So we have that in Santiago. That's kind of ongoing for 6 months, over the whole summer, May to October. So, hundreds of pilgrims have been through that process. And that is just to help people reflect. And again, it uses a lot of the Ignatian principles. So that thing about creating a space, everybody gets a chance to speak, and there's no commentary on what people say. Well, there's no interruptions. So as a facilitator, my job is just to protect people's space, and let people speak. Because even one or two seemingly harmless comments can really stop someone in their tracks and can really throw them off. So protecting a space, it's got like a sacred space where people are talking about their own deeply personal experience, what has happened on the Camino. And inevitably something has happened, something significant, something good or bad, something joyful or sad or suffering, difficult, whatever it is, something has happened and people need to process it. They need time and space and people to help them, people to listen to them in order to process that. And I always say to people, finishing the Camino is only halfway. You still need to do all that extra work about reflection, bringing it back home, putting it into action, and trying to live life differently. Try to live life as a pilgrim, obviously, is our key challenge back at home. Not just to fall back in the same old patterns or act as if, the Camino is just a thing in Spain. I always say that the Camino is a place in your heart that you can always access. It's this amazing source of wisdom and light and energy and transformation. And our job is to try to live from that always, try to be connected to ourselves and be connected to others and realize that same dynamic on the Camino, it always applies to our life, different moments, situations. So trying to get through difficult situations when I'm, with a coworker at work or something situation at home, there's always a way through that. If I'm kind of reflective, if I'm tuned in, if I realize that I have options about how I could live this. So all of our work on that Camino Companion in that book that we wrote is trying to encourage people to bring that home and to put in place some of the structures that would help you to live that. So that review of the day we just spoke about, I recommend that really highly for people. Other things like journaling as a discipline is really helpful to write down what's happening during my day, my thoughts, my desires. Obviously, to try to prioritize what my life is about, to look at my life and what I do and my job and where I'm going and how I spend my time is an enormous thing. Try to stay connected to the Camino community. So watching Camino films, for example, connecting with Camino groups, trying to keep that spirit alive. It's such a fantastic experience. So not to let it die and to implement it in my life is the key thing. And obviously, coming from my Jesuit background, I'm trying to encourage people to live that reflective, slower pace of life, being in the moment, being more tuned in, tuned to oneself, tuned to others, tuned to the world. And that is infinitely more satisfying. It's more challenging back at home, but boy, does it deliver in terms of meaning and purpose and some kind of satisfaction about things.
I've started to feel like discourse about bringing the Camino home, it feels a little bit like discourse surrounding weight loss programs that there's everyone's looking for it, everyone's looking
Yeah.
for the answer and no one can find it, and people are trying different things and it's not working quite the way that they want. And part of me wonders, are we setting our expectations too high? Like, do we not have a clear enough sense of what it would mean to successfully bring the Camino home? Should we be more precise about what our goals are for that?
Mm. No, I think that's a really good point. I always go back to there's a book by John Alexander Shia
Yeah.
called Returning from the Camino. I actually met him in Murcia just a few weeks ago, and I spoke to him about this point. But I think his book is the real landmark about how to do this and the necessity of that and how that works out. I think he lays out the process really well, but I think what's really clear is that this is a spiritual kind of discipline and a spiritual invitation. So that's a huge thing, to give yourself over to that, to believe that, this is possible, that this is part of our lives, our ordinary lives, and not to separate, our Camino life from my own life back at home, but to try to integrate those two things to bring them together. I suspect you're right as well. I think you have to lower your expectations a bit. It's not going to be like on the Camino. I think that is really clear. It doesn't work the same way. It's not as easy. Things are much more difficult. People are not like on the Camino. People are living these tough lives and in these roles and living under huge burdens. So things are much tougher. But I think within that, I think it's still possible to carve out a bit of a more meaningful existence for yourself and to live in a better place, without setting goals too high. But obviously, this is what I do myself, in my own kind of religious life. And my whole Jesuit training, I remember, was to train us how to be pilgrims in the world, how to live that life always and how to be continually on the road, how to be continually learning, continually believing that something new is happening, unfolding all the time. It's a huge ask, and I think you couldn't expect everybody to live that same Jesuit commitment. I think that would be unrealistic. But I think to pick up bits and pieces of that would work for you in your life, to have elements of that that help you to keep focus and keep on track. I think some of that is possible. I've seen it happen and I've helped people to do that very thing. Obviously, in my own life and ministry, man, I give retreats and talks and, I meet people one-to-one basis and a lot of the Camino comes up all the time
Yeah.
within that, obviously as a metaphor, but also people's experience of being on the road and people's desire to be a pilgrim in the world.
It seems like to me the biggest challenge isn't I think often when we think about the Camino, we think about external things and bringing it home. And really, the challenge we have at home is just a crisis of interiority that we don't have that time to just live with clarity inside our heads. We are always filling that space with other things.
I think that's an excellent point. I'm just back from Santiago about 2 weeks ago, obviously, and I was saying that very thing. I was celebrating the Mass in English in the Pilgrim office. I always say to people at the Mass, I say, when you go home, you have a choice about how you live. I mean, people seem to think they don't have a choice. They have to keep doing this thing. And I say, you have a choice about what you value, what you prioritize, how you live your life. And you can change that yourself. You can make a difference and you can do extraordinary things. It's quite difficult and you need a lot of support and structures and discipline and everything. But it is possible. It's possible to do that. And many people have done that. Many people have made real serious life changes as a result of the Camino, have kind of turned everything around and have lived this different life. And that invitation is always there. And that invitation to a fuller life, I think, is always there. There are huge resistances within us, and there are huge kind of areas that are very tricky and very difficult. And navigating those things takes quite a bit of work and perseverance and dedication and all. But it is possible. I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen myself. I try to live that myself, obviously, as well.
Let's finish up with this. There was recently an article published in the AP about the Camino Ignaciano, the Ignatian Way. So a lot of attention to that route that you've mentioned a couple different times. And the concern it raises, so it's focused on the founder of the route. He's getting older. So the article was raising these concerns about the long-term viability of the Camino Ignaciano. So I wonder if you could just talk about the route and what makes it special to you and why maybe some pilgrims who are looking for another Camino to walk should check it out.
Yeah, exactly. The Ignatian Camino Ignaciano, it runs from the Basque Country, from Loyola, which I mentioned at the beginning, where Ignatius was born. It runs across to Manresa, near Barcelona, which is where he ended up spending a year. And he was kind of had all these spiritual experiences there. But the key thing for us, for Jesuits especially, is that it links together all these key Ignatian sites where Ignatius Loyola had these experiences. So this thing about walking in his footsteps is an enormous thing for us, and that's why we have to do that pilgrimage, that Camino in our novitiate. It's part of our training. You have to literally walk in his footsteps in order to get the insight into his experiences, in order to appreciate what he experienced. So being in those places is extraordinary. Being in Loyola, in that bedroom where he was recuperating from his wound, it has an atmosphere and it has a I can feel myself getting emotional just thinking about it. I remember that night back in 1994, before we started our Camino, the following day at midnight, we're in that room. There's just the two of us. We're trying to get our heads together and we're trying to get off on this Camino we're heading off on, and we're the power of that moment, and being in that room, realizing the history of the Jesuits, the experience that started all of this with him convalescing, it all just comes together in this real, tangible, electric atmosphere. So to live those experiences in all those places, there's about 5 or 6 key Ignatian places along the route. So I recommend it to people just to get that flavor of those experiences and to get these insights around that. But it is hard work, it has to be said. The route is, it's not that well set up. There's not a lot of options for albergues, for example, and you have to be pretty flexible. You probably need a little bit of Spanish. But I have seen people do this, which works well, that you can pick and choose the main sites. I brought a group of Americans, Jesuit alumni last summer on the Ignatian route, and we just took 12 days and we picked the main places and we walked every day, but we try to hit all those significant places in order to get the insights behind the experiences. And we had a fabulous Camino experience, ending up in Manresa, which is this big retreat house in Catalonia where Ignatius had these experiences. And there's a cave at the end, the actual cave where Ignatius lived, as a kind of a beggar, and he was kind of sleeping rough, and he was writing these notes about his experiences. So like you get this direct connection to the guy and his experience, and it gives you these insights you wouldn't get otherwise. So it's a very particular Camino, and it has a very particular flavor to it. But I recommend, if you're interested at all in this Ignatian thing and the spirituality, that I would recommend it. It's worth the effort, and it has a special flavor, and it delivers something different than the other Caminos.
I'm not Catholic, I'm not Christian, but something occurred to me. I spent 3 months walking in Italy in the spring, and I was walking the Franciscan way, literally in the footsteps of Francis, the way of Saint Benedict, so following the track of his life, the way of Saint Anthony, following Saint Anthony. All of these humans, these men who had been in these places, we have the stories of them passing through. We have all of these insights that they developed over the course of their lives about how to live. And I realized that for all of the years that I have been walking the Camino in Spain, I've never had that kind of relationship with James because he's so much of a legend. There's just not that much tangible material to work with on James.
Yeah.
And as someone who is not of the faith, that meant that I wasn't engaging with Christianity along the way with the kind of depth that maybe I should have been, and that became more accessible in Italy when I had these more tangible figures to engage with. And for me, that's become something that I'm thinking about a lot, that's important to me, not in the sense of me being indoctrinated into Christianity, but just tapping into the deep wisdom that is accessible human to human by connecting with figures like Ignatius.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. That's a great insight. That's a great insight there. And that's the advantage of walking in the footsteps of a founder, a figure, and there's a kind of a spirituality and a system. And to get the insights, and like you just reminded me there, one of the big Ignatian or Jesuit things is about this thing about freedom, about inner freedom. It means the capacity to adjust to a new reality, to let go of things, especially. And like I know a lot of people, myself probably as well, that people feel that they're very free in their heads intellectually, but you have to walk it to experience it really, are you really free? Like, can you really let go of that interaction or that conflict you had with someone there? Can you really let that go? It's not until you kind of walk it and you kind of integrate it in your body, that experience, that you start to learn the real insights, and that's the Camino in a nutshell. It's not an intellectual thing. It's not an ideology. It's like a concrete experience of the spirit or God or the divine or whatever you want to call it. But something magic happens that otherwise it wouldn't happen, and you'd never get those insights.
It's funny, kind of like the positive psychology link. I'm thinking now about Bayesian statistics and our capacity to take in new evidence and adjust our priors all the time. And that's
Yeah,
what you're describing, our ability to grow and change as we encounter new experiences.
exactly. That fundamental openness to reality and to the world, I think there's a huge learning there. And the Camino teaches that big time, just just be there and be open. But like that is that thing again, you can't do the Camino and not be open or not grow or not experience difficulty. I think that's the essence of it. It kind of cracks you open like a nut, and it opens you up for a glorious kind of openness and generosity that you thought you never realized you were capable of.
Well, thank you, Brendan. This has been great. I really did learn a lot from your writing, and I appreciate your ability to weave together so well your personal story, the story of your experience on the Camino, and then also these Ignatian insights.
Oh, thank you, Dave. It's been a real pleasure.
All right, everyone, I got a plane to catch and a long day of travel ahead. Let's see how this goes. I have a 2.5-hour connection in Amsterdam. I'm supposed to touch down in Geneva at 4:30 p.m. My train departs the airport at 5:15 p.m. I have a generous 13-minute transfer window in Martigny, a 2-minute connection time in Saint-Branchais, and then a couple minutes to get from the train to the bus in Orsières. If all goes well, I'll be in Bourg Saint-Pierre around 8 p.m. And if it doesn't, well, I might be sleeping in my bivvy in a patch of woods somewhere. It's all part of the adventure. Regardless, I won't for a minute lose sight of how lucky I am to get to do this, even if I'm sleeping in those woods. I think there's sometimes some magical thinking out there about how people in my position manage to commit to this kind of travel. I'm not independently wealthy. I didn't benefit from some amazing inheritance. I'm a high school teacher. I'm fortunate that I graduated without debt. I opted for in-state schooling to help make that possible instead of a pricier private college. I also decided early on that I didn't want to have kids. Those little buggers are expensive. But, the podcast loses money. I could leverage it with Spotify and YouTube ads, but I don't want to. Maybe I'll get desperate at some point. Guidebooks on less traveled routes like the Norte don't rake in big dollars. And every time I need to rewalk the route to make updates, that pretty well burns through whatever I've made. It's cool to get to make a pilgrimage at cost, of course, but nobody's getting rich off publishing in 2025 unless maybe you're a romantasy author. I spent 3 months, no exaggeration, pretty much every day, one after another, researching and writing the Camino Compendium. If I end up making half of what I could have earned as a substitute teacher during that time, I will be stoked. The Patreon, admittedly, has been a help, and I'm grateful to everyone who has supported me on that front over the last year or helped by buying one of my books. All of that said, I don't have revenue streams. I have trickles. But enough trickles and maybe you get one stream. I guess there are 3 points to make in all of this. 1, you don't do this stuff to get rich. You do it for personal fulfillment. That's it. Fortunately, I'm getting a lot of personal fulfillment from it. I'm thoroughly content. But don't harbor any illusions on that front. 2, I'm fortunate to be in a financial and a health position where I have this kind of flexibility to sacrifice multiple years of prime earning potential in order to pursue something different. It's weird, right? Like I could keep climbing the ladder in education, but I just haven't had that interest or that fire. This is what I wanted to spend 2 years doing in the middle of my life. And 3, you might be able to do this too, even if you don't realize it right now. It took me a while, 10 years of focused preparation to get to this point, where my savings were such and my housing situation was settled enough that I could have this kind of freedom and flexibility. And I come into it knowing it won't last forever. But why wait until I'm 65 or 70 to do this sort of thing? Why not tackle it now, while I'm still kind of near my walking physical peak? Why not maximize that opportunity now in the present? If COVID taught me one thing, it's don't just assume that something is going to be there waiting for you a year from now or 2 years from now. The world can shut down, sad enough to say, and our health is never guaranteed. So I'm going to seize this opportunity while I can. And maybe there's an opening for you to do that too, because regardless of the cost, it's worth every penny. That's all for this episode. Thanks again to Father Brennan McManus. You can find his books, including Redemption Road and Living the Camino Back Home, on Amazon and other online bookstores. And you can find Brendan at redemptionroadcamino.com. All episodes of the Camino Podcast can be found on Spotify, Apple, SoundCloud, and YouTube. You can reach me at CaminoPodcast@gmail.com and through the Camino Podcast Facebook page. And you can support the pod on Patreon at patreon.com/Dave Whitson. See you this winter.